So if we did our job with pages 1 through 9 of the Nicomachean Ethics, then we've got the project set up and you know what Aristotle's trying to accomplish in this book. Again, we got a general account of happiness last time. That general account of happiness is, of course, about being excellent at the activity of being human. And as we saw last time, the activity of being human is rational activity. But again, rationality isn't just one kind of an activity, it is in fact two. So there's the active, possessing, exercising element of rationality that we can call intellectual, and then there's the self-obedient aspect of rationality, making decisions, acting on them, etc. So, talking about moral virtue, this first section on virtue, Aristotle is going to talk about the excellence of this second kind of rational activity. And again, excellence of activity simply meaning what does it mean to be good at doing this thing? If by moral virtue we mean excellence of the obedient part of the rational soul, then excellence at this activity, being very good at this, will be the ability to make and act on good decisions. And again, good decisions insofar as they are decisions that are going to make you happy. Remember, we are only concerned with happiness in this book. So if we're going to talk about moral virtue today, it is only because there is some way of acting intentionally that is going to lead to living a good life or going to be living a good life. So let's start with this word moral, because of course it sounds like Aristotle is smuggling in morals, which I promised you last lecture he was not going to do. Good does not mean morally good or approved of by, God or society or your mom. And so if Aristotle is smuggling morals in here, that would be problematic. So the word Aristotle uses for moral is ethikos. Ethikos here, again, gets translated as moral, and it's certainly, you can see why. Ethikos is where we get our English word ethics from. But just as we encountered with the word virtue, about 2,000 years of Christianity and other things mean that we hear the word moral a little bit differently. I want to translate moral, our ethikos, as character rather than moral. So ethikos is simply, let's say, an adjective describing things concerned with your character. Ethikon ariton will be the phrase being translated in your reading as moral virtues. I just want to think about this as excellences of character, aspects that make your character excellent as opposed to things that make you morally virtuous. Aristotle tells you right up front in this reading, Book 2, Chapter 2, that moral virtue comes about as a result of habit, which is why he says its name, ethike, is one that is formed by a slight variation of the word ethos, or habit. So character in this sense does not imply any kind of moral judgment. Character is simply a description of the way you usually act. If I say that you're doing something out of character, I'm not saying you're doing something good or something bad. I'm simply saying that you're acting in a way that you don't typically act. So you can do things that are out of character that are good things. You can do things that are out of character that are bad things. Character, in this sense, isn't an evaluation of you morally as a person. It's simply discussing your habits, the way you typically behave. So a way of trying to figure out what moral virtue is simply then to ask, what is it that makes habits good? What does it mean to have an excellent habit? What generally is the account that we can give of habits that distinguishes the excellent ones from the bad ones? Aristotle's answer is going to be known as the mean. As he says in Book 2, Chapter 6, virtue is a state of character concerned with choice, lying in a mean. In other words, the mean relative to us, this being determined by a rational principle, and by that principle by which the man of practical wisdom would determine it. Now, mean here is a mathematical language. average. You can say that mean means average, but in this case, having excellent habits isn't behaving averagely or in an average sort of a way. Rather, mean is going to lie between two extremes. So in this case, the extremes, as Aristotle says, are deficiency and excess. Think of this as the Goldilocks and the Three Bears approach to good habits. There is too little, there's too much, and there's just right. So when we think about what it means to have an excellent habit, and more importantly, how we develop excellent habits, we're going to think about doing things in the right way, into the right amount, not doing them too much, not doing them too little. You'll see that this account really nicely sort of applies to all of the standard virtues. So, for example, courage, Aristotle's favorite virtue. Aristotle is an ancient Greek. The ancient Greeks love courage. You can think about courage as a middle ground between the excess, foolhardiness, being too courageous, rushing into things, when you shouldn't, versus a deficiency of courage, having too little courage, what we would call cowardice. Likewise, if patience is a virtue, as my mother never tires of saying, this means having too much patience. You're sort of passive even when you should act, you wait too long, you give people too much rope, etc. And of course, you can have too little patience. You can be impatient. You need to wait more. Temperance, another one of these standard virtues that Aristotle pulls from Plato and elsewhere. Having too much temperance. So, what we might call self-neglect, or, allowing people to sort of take advantage of you, as opposed to too little temperance. You're taking too much. You're taking more than you should, selfishness. So pick your favorite moral virtue, and it should follow this account. This is a way to think about what does it mean to have an excellent habit. And the virtue here isn't a habit. The virtue is the excellence of the habit. So the excellence of responding to fear is courage. To habitually respond correctly to fear is to be courageous. If you habitually rush in without thinking, you're foolhardy. If you habitually let fear overpower you, you are cowardly. If you habitually respond in the right way to fear, you are courageous. Notice, however, that it is not just the standard virtues that can be thought of through this model, this middle ground. Really, Aristotle is talking about any and all habits. After all, if character is not a moral evaluation of you, but simply a description of the way you normally behave, then all kinds of habits will be a part of your character. And so I want to focus on some non-typically moral or non-sort of moral in the usual sense habits here, just to show you how Aristotle's approach, how Aristotle's account of the mean really does apply across our habits, across our behavior. So if you were to think about practicing a sport or exercising, for example, you can see that good exercise habits or good practice habits also fall right within this model, this format. So good practice, you need to practice enough to get better, right? If you don't practice enough, you're never going to improve. But by the same token, not practicing enough, not putting in enough effort is not the only way to ruin your habit, to ruin your form. If you practice too much, you can get injured, you can burn out, you can sort of overdo it, you can neglect the rest of your life. And so good practice habits will also lie right in that mean. So if we think about virtues, if we think about good habits, we can't just think about the standard sort of normal moral virtues, courage, patience, humility, etc., etc., etc. We also have to think about things like exercise, eating habits, sleeping habits, study habits. All of these are under the more general account of what Aristotle means by moral activities. So again, we're not smuggling morals in here. When we talk about quote-unquote moral virtue or excellent habits, we're really looking holistically. We're looking at everything that you do, and we're thinking about you having excellent habits. So Again, you can now ask me, okay, well, I see what excellent habits are, but what does any of this have to do with happiness, right? After all, Aristotle says that living the good life is having excellence of rational activity. This building habits is a way of behaving intentionally, sort of acting for a purpose. But what does excellent habits in this case have to do with being happy? So I want us to think about, again, a sort of more normal, non-moral example. Let's just think about, let's say, the example of eating habits. So if you habitually undereat, and again, this is why habits is so important, right? It's not just about having one meal that's too small or skipping a meal. If you habitually undereat, I want you to think about what happens to you. You start to lose weight, you're tired all the time, your immune system takes a hit, etc. Bad things happen to your body. And of course, if you could keep this up long enough, if you really neglect yourself, eventually death. So sort of declining health and death. Likewise, though, if you habitually overeat, so again, not just one meal that's too large, but if you make this a habit, again, you run into health problems. You gain weight, adult onset diabetes, heart disease, your cholesterol shoots through the roof, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And again, declining health, and if you really keep this up, if you really overdo it, eventually death. But now the question is, what happens if you habitually eat the right amount? And of course, nothing happens, right? It's not nothing that happens. It's just nothing bad happens to you. You just sort of maintain. You don't gain weight. You don't lose weight. Your health does not take a hit. You're still going to die, of course, but you're not going to die from eating. You're just sort of, you're eating in a way that is good for you. Furthermore, though, notice that what we do habitually, and here's the other important aspect of habits, what you habitually do feels normal. So if you habitually undereat, when you sit down and have your too small meal, your celery with cottage cheese and a Diet Coke with a lime, that's going to feel normal to you. And normal is essentially feeling good, right? It may not cause a whole lot of pleasure, but it at least feels right. As opposed to if you read Aristotle and you say, yeah, you know what? I really need to shape up. I really need to improve. If you're used to undereating and you try eating the right amount, imagine how you're going to feel. You're going to feel too full, right? This is way more food than you're typically eating. And so you feel too full, you feel sick, you feel bad. Likewise, though, if you habitually overeat, if you habitually eat too much, that feels normal. So when you sit down and have your usual 5-course lunch, with a chocolate shake for dessert, this doesn't just feel normal, this feels fantastic, right? Eating is fun, eating is pleasurable, you're eating too much, and it feels good. But if you read Aristotle and you say, yeah, I really need to shape up, and you try eating the right amount just once, notice that feels bad. It's not fulfilling. It's not satisfying. You're still hungry at the end. I don't feel like I got enough food. As opposed to, if you habitually eat the right amount, then of course eating the right amount feels normal. Eating the right amount feels good. Notice that if you try under-eating just once, it's not satisfactory, right? You don't feel like you've gotten enough food. If you try overeating just once, that feels bad too, right? You feel too full. You feel sick. This is why habits are the important unit of measure here. It's not about specific decisions. It's not about specific actions. If you habitually eat well, if you habitually eat correctly, you have no ill effects. It's not making you sick. It's good for you. And it feels good. But likewise, that habit also means that doing what is bad for you, either underdoing it or overdoing it, also then feels bad. And so this means a good habit is where this good for you aligns with what feels good. Now, this is important to think about because if what we normally do is what feels good to us, that means I can't really just trust how I feel to guide me to doing the right thing, right? So if I just eat until I'm not hungry anymore, well, that only works if I'm already eating the right amount. So I can't rely on pleasure. Fulfilling a habit, and especially a good habit, will bring pleasure with it. But if we chase the pleasure, we end up getting into trouble. As opposed to if we chase the good habit, if we chase doing what is good for you, then pleasure comes with it. And so this is when Aristotle says that we must take as a sign of states of character that pleasure and pain that ensue on acts. This is what he means, right? So I can see whether or not I've acquired the good habit if doing what's good for me feels good. So to delight in and to be pained by the things that we ought, right? So if I'm taking pleasure in good things and if I'm being caused pain by bad things, by overdoing it or underdoing it, that's a sign that I have a good state of character. As opposed to the opposite, right? If I have a bad state of character, then doing what's good for me feels bad, and doing what's bad for me feels good. If I habitually overeat, then what's killing me feels good, and trying to do the right thing feels bad. As opposed to, the nice thing about that good habit is it's going to keep you steered correctly. That good habit means all of a sudden doing what's bad for you also feels bad, so you're going to avoid it. In this way, good habits reproduce themselves. Bad habits, unfortunately, do too, as you know if you've tried to break one. But this is why it's so important to develop good, excellent habits. Those good, excellent habits will replicate themselves. You will feel good, and that pleasure and pain will keep you on track. Likewise, though, the good habit is determined by what is good for you. And so when Aristotle says that the virtue of man, the virtue of a person, will be the state of character which makes you good and which makes you do your work well. And he doesn't just mean showing up at your job, right? He means living your life. When we talk about being healthy, for example, what does it mean to be healthy? It means to be free of disease. It means to be, not prevented from living your life actively, living your life the way you should. And so habits that are good for you, again, good in this case, excellence, virtue, this will be the state of character which makes you thrive, which makes you live well. And when you are living well habitually, that's also going to feel good. And so this is going to be the account of moral virtue. Living in a way that is good for you, and that feels good, and that's why this has everything to do with happiness.